Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. It's Friday night and I'm joined by Aaron Bastani. Aaron, how are you doing?
Michael, I'm extraordinarily well. I can't wait for our little Friday tete-a-tete. Hope you're doing well too.
I am perfectly fine. Coming up on tonight's show, the Archbishop of Canterbury's resignation speech goes down like a lead balloon. This is a guy you would imagine had sort of been trained to have tact. You'd have thought that'd be part of the job. He doesn't seem to. We speak to an expert about the current state of trans healthcare in the UK. And Australia bans social media for under 16s. First, though, before we get into our first story, we have launched our fundraiser. Every now and again, every year or so, we do a big drive to get more people signed up to support Novara Media because this show is not remotely possible without you guys. The vast, vast majority of our funding comes from very small donors, people who watch this show, who read our articles, who listen to our podcasts, and are kind enough to sign up and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. If that's you already, thank you so much. We are ever appreciative. You make all of this possible. If you aren't one of those people yet, what are you waiting for? Please do go to novaramedia.com/support. Our ask is for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month or whatever you can afford. We really, really do appreciate it. That's novaramedia.com/support. Rebels are continuing their surprise advance across Syria and have gained control of the country's fourth largest city, Hama. The Islamist militant group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham took control of Syria's second largest city, Aleppo, earlier this week and are now only kilometers away from Homs, which has a population of 1.5 million. This is part of Channel 4's latest report on the capture of Hama.
Just over a week since it started, and this extraordinary rebel advance rolls on, right into the heart of Syria's fourth largest city, Hama. The Islamist fighters of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham cheered as they go. What's the situation? Where are we? Asks one. We're in the center of Hama, comes the reply. Nearby, the city's prison. This is a regime that specializes in arbitrary detention. 130,000 people estimated to have been disappeared since 2011. But the regime is now gone from this city, and these men are suddenly free.
May God destroy Assad. We got rid of him. May the Lord burn his heart. We are 1,500 prisoners with 50 crammed in one room. May God burn his heart.
For decades a centre of anti-Assad opposition, the capture of Hama is a major moment, showing the growing ambition of these forces and their Sunni Islamist leader who broke with Al-Qaeda 8 years ago and is trying to reassure the country's many minorities that his fighters aren't a threat.
Good news, my brothers. Your Mujahideen brothers, the revolutionaries, have started to enter the city of Hama to cleanse the wound that has persisted in Syria for 40 years. I pray to God that this will be a conquest without vengeance, but one of mercy and compassion.
You heard there the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, trying to reassure ordinary Syrians they would be safe under the group's control. Many, though, don't seem convinced. Tens of thousands of people are understood to be fleeing Homs, including terrified members of President Assad's Alawite minority community. The leader of the Islamist rebels, Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, is clearly on a diplomatic offensive, though, sitting down for a 10-minute interview with CNN.
People who fear Islamic governance either have seen incorrect implementations of it or do not understand it properly. We are talking about something that aligns with the traditions and nature of the region. The most important thing is to build institutions. We are not talking about rule by individuals or personal whims. It's about institutional governance. Syria deserves a governing system that is institutional, not one where a single ruler makes arbitrary decisions. What is happening in Syria is significant for the entire world. This event has positive repercussions globally because under the regime's rule, Syria became a source of concern and trouble for everyone. Stabilizing Syria will bring many people back. Today, in the liberated areas, about 1/3 of the population lives in camps, approximately 1.5 million people. I believe we can soon reach a point where there are no camps. With the rehabilitation of the liberated areas, people will return to their homes. Many refugees in Turkey will likely return, as will a significant number of refugees in Lebanon and Jordan. Even refugees in Europe may return to rebuild their country.
Now, Aaron, I want your views on this. That was al-Jilani, I mean, a former al-Qaeda leader. I mean, really putting himself forward really as the savior of Syria to the Western press and saying, you know, it's going to be so peaceful, so brilliant that refugees are going to be able to come back from Europe once we've overthrown Assad. I'm not sure I'm convinced. What's your take?
Well, first of all, what a scoop for CNN, Michael. And that's certainly one we'd like to have on Downstream, is former member of Al-Qaeda now overseeing a successful military push against Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Look, you obviously can't judge somebody entirely by their past, but if they were a member of Al-Qaeda, then an Al-Qaeda affiliate, and now they're involved in, you know, an organization which fundamentally is drawing on those precise same networks, I am also circumspect. However, you have to say that there must be a certain level of political acumen going on in order for him to be saying what he said to CNN. Clearly, that's attempting to target Western audiences. You know, you've got voting publics across Europe right now which really care about migration. I know lots of our audience don't care about it, and they think we should, you know, have more people coming, for instance, with regards to asylum. I certainly think that we should do asylum in Europe more equitably, and we should have a pan-European system of coordinating that. But it's beyond contention that in countries like Italy, France, the UK, Germany, etc., when it comes to undocumented migration, or when it comes to refugees coming from Western Asia, particularly Syria, Iraq, they would love to see at least some people return home. And of course, some people would love to return home. Many would, in fact. The question is, would they like it under this particular government if it comes to pass? Well, we'll have to see. But like I say, it does underscore a certain level of political acumen to be able to do that. And you have to be fair, from the rapidity of this offensive, and then the sort of political halo around it, the kinds of things that are being said. We want stability in the region. The war has created massive instability, not just for West Asia, but Europe too. We want to protect the diversity of Syria, all of its communities. We've protected Christians, etc. These are all things which are fundamentally true or not, and I am no authority on whether or not they are true, but the fact they're being articulated in the manner that they are is about reaching out to Western audiences, finding favorability amongst not just the electorate, but also senior political figures too. Something like Giorgia Meloni in Italy, she will love hearing this. And just as collaborating with Libya with regards to migration flows was unthinkable 5, 6, 7 years ago, well, guess what? That's now happening between the Italians and the Libyans. I wouldn't be surprised if certain corridors of power in Europe several years from now are looking to actively work with a Syrian government that looks like this in terms of the repatriation of refugees from Syria.
I mean, I'm not an expert on the Syrian civil war. I suppose where I sort of stand on these things generally is that there's very few options which are worse than the reopening of a deadly civil war. You know, I sort of see there's sort of every time sort of there's a development in Syria, there's a big debate on sort of like left Twitter. Are you defending Assad? Is Assad a good guy? Is he a bad guy? Clearly, he's a bad guy, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean, this rebellion is going to be good for the Syrian people, because rebellions often lead to civil wars, especially in a situation like this. And even if we were to believe al-Jilani, that he's changed, and I don't necessarily, we all remember sort of the Taliban saying, we're different this time, we're going to be really respectful of women's rights. And then obviously, of course, the moment they retake power, that doesn't seem to be the case. But even if he were being honest and he wanted a sort of like stable, moderate government where all minority rights are respected, that's not how it would go, right? If it were the case that the Assad regime completely collapses, it's not going to be the case that all the other different rebel factions are like, it's best if we all decide quickly who can be the leader. We'll give it to al-Jilani. He can have a nice moderate government here, and ideally that will bring stability, and then we can bring some of the refugees back. That's not what will happen, right? If the state collapses, then which also seems somewhat unlikely, right? Then you will have all the different factions all fighting, and this is the kind of vacuum where we saw the rise of ISIS before. And I'm not saying I haven't seen like many, but there aren't loads of people on Twitter who are like really celebrating this rebellion. But I do think sort of there is a tendency for people to view it as good guys, bad guys, or they're all bad guys, or I condemn this, I condemn that. And I suppose for me, I take a very sort of an approach from realism, really, which is the outcome, which is going to cause the least suffering, which won't necessarily be the most just one. I mean, if you're sort of frustrated watching this because this is a bit abstract, that's fair enough. I'm telling you, I'm not an expert on Syria. But Aaron, what's your do you have any response to that?
No, I entirely agree. The whole good guy, bad guy thing is stupid. What's really specific about Syria, though, Michael, and you talk about state failure, is you have a state on the ropes, which is the Assad state, and you have two proto-states. You have the state with Gilani sort of essentially the proto-state with Gilani at its head. And of course, you have the SDF, Kurdish forces in Syrian Kurdistan. So you have these two proto-states and you have a regular state. That's quite unusual, Michael, right? Particularly when we talk about state failure, a lack of sovereignty, a lack of a rule of law, etc. Actually, what we're seeing here is something slightly different. I mean, this is a dream for a political scientist, by the way. Of course, there's more important things to consider, but it's a petri dish, actually, of seeing proto-states against a declining state apparatus. You are right, however, that this idea that, oh, well, if Assad goes, then people will return from Europe to Syria is, for now, nonsense. In the short to medium term, it's going to create more migration flows. Obviously, pro-Assad populations are moving towards the coast where they view themselves as being safe. Of course, you've seen all kinds of atrocities from all sides. And if you were somebody who viewed themselves as on side with the Assad regime, of course you would flee. So, like you said, there are no good guys and bad guys in a situation like this. And the moderate rebels meme, it was ridiculous 10 years ago. It's even more ridiculous now. You know, the idea that this person may come to power and they'll be, overseeing diversity of views in a free Syria, and there'll be skyscrapers built in homes, and we'll have KPMG and Starbucks and Merrill Lynch. No, that's not the lesson, really, is it, of the 21st century? Best case scenario, you can have something resembling a state with a rule of law where people aren't displaced, and over decades, people can rebuild their lives again gradually. I think, as somebody just looking at this from the outside, if I was Syrian, I think Assad would be the best bet for that. Although, of course, in the long term, autocracies don't tend to be particularly stable. But the idea that Syria is going to become a sort of pluralist liberal democracy this time next year, if just we back the good guys, simply isn't the case. And even if you have people at the top of proto-states, including people who are formerly members of Al-Qaeda, even if those people are somewhat enlightened, they do want to oversee a project like that, the political and military constituency which they draw upon is not like that at all. If somebody's willing to wage war for years, they have seen friends die, they have killed people, those are not, generally speaking, the kinds of individuals who then oversee a stable, peaceful governmental regime. Where you have autocracies come over, somebody seizes power, a historic strong man, they historically have come from national armies, right? Whether that's Reza Shah in Iran in the 1920s, Ataturk before him with Turkey, many examples. They come from a military background. So maybe there is somebody in Assad's military forces who can do a better job than him at being the figurehead of a quote-unquote Syrian state. That remains to be seen. But these proto-states, as I've said, there are two. Historically, they didn't have a particularly good record at the things this gentleman's talking about: stability, overseeing, diversity, etc.
Justin Welby resigned as Archbishop of Canterbury last month after a report found he could have done more to bring serial abuser John Smythe to justice. It's a deeply serious issue, but bizarrely, in his final speech to the House of Lords yesterday, the outgoing Archbishop had a go at some stand-up.
The reality is that there comes a time, if you are technically leading a particular institution or area of responsibility, where the shame of what has gone wrong, whether one is personally responsible or not, must require a head to roll. And there is only, in this case, one head that rolls well enough. I hope not literally, one of my predecessors in 1371, Simon of Sudbury, had his head cut off, and it was then the peasants, the revolting peasants at the time, played football with it at the Tower of London. I don't know who won. It certainly wasn't Simon of Sudbury.
That speech didn't go down well with one of John Smythe's victims, Mark Stibb, who said this to ITV.
I would describe the tone as frivolous, and I think that's very deeply upsetting for those of us who are Smythe survivors, because for some of us it's been a matter of life and death. The whole thing has seemed to Smythe survivors like a retirement happily brought forward rather than an act of public contrition and repentance.
Justin Welby today apologised for the tone of his speech. Aaron, I mean, clearly Justin Welby feels a bit bitter that he's had to resign. I mean, he seems to think that he hasn't really done anything wrong. The argument he makes is that, yes, this report said he could have done a bit more to tell the police about this guy, but he said he thought the person responsible in the Church of England, was sort of covering it. And he's saying that he has increased the sort of child protection element of the Church of England massively since getting into the role. So he clearly feels like he's only resigning because he has to. Someone's got to take the hit. But to sort of stand up in the House of Lords and just say that publicly is really strange. Like there's not much point in resigning and then saying, but I shouldn't really have had to resign. I mean, it kind of, if you're gonna lose the job, go the whole hog and say, I'm really genuinely sorry and that's why I'm resigning. Not like, oh God, I'm resigning because I felt like I should do, but isn't this a bit ridiculous?
Well, he may be in the strange position, Michael, where he actually has to now resign before he resigns. He had a formal resignation process with a date, etc. And I think maybe he has to resign before then. Maybe they're going to have to reject his resignation so he can be sacked. I don't know. It's all very strange. This is somebody who went to Eton, by the way. I think he then went to Cambridge. A scion of the British elite. I think his mum was the secretary to Winston Churchill. I think his biological father, who he found out about in later life, I think was a senior diplomat. His great uncle was Rab Butler, a very senior conservative figure in the post-war period. So really, a member of the elite, really expensive schooling. And if you watch that whole clip on X, Michael, it's 2 or 3 minutes. Certainly a longer clip than we just played. He can barely form sentences. He's garbling his words. And for this to be the speech of an Archbishop of Canterbury who is resigning, bear in mind that's the man who places the crown on King Charles III's head. You think this is quite a serious figure. A lot of money was spent on his education, and yet, he seemingly can't even speak properly. It does say something about the British elite. They really are cooked. But then going to the actual content of what you're saying, Michael, you're quite right. The point of an apology is that you're contrite. You say, I feel really bad. He was giving an apology. He say, well, look, I don't really feel bad. I just kind of have to do it. And it's fine to say that in Strangers' Bar. It's not fine to say that in the Houses of Parliament. And it really just underscores to me how Welby was never a serious figure. I think he's really emblematic, actually, of the state of the British establishment. Deeply, deeply unserious man. Thinks that just because he's one of the goodies, that makes him very virtuous. Time after time, however, his moral compass has been wanting. He wanted to make Paula Venables, the Bishop of London. She was, of course, at one point the CEO of the Post Office. She was deeply imbricated with the Horizon scandal. He wanted her to be the Bishop of London. Talk about being a bad judge of character. And then you have this stuff too. He famously involved himself in the democratic process ahead of the 2019 general election. He made a political intervention criticizing one of the 2 major candidates to be the prime minister. Of course, one was Boris Johnson, the other was Jeremy Corbyn. He was involved in a pile on Jeremy Corbyn ahead of the 2019 general election. A real democratic disgrace. Frankly, bishops should not be, I think, legislators, unelected legislators in the House of Lords. I don't think we should have a House of Lords. I think we should have one house. It should be unicameral, the House of Commons. If that sounds crazy, guess what? Norway seemed to manage just fine with that. And I would have PR for that one single chamber, which would mean, yes, it would be quite hard to pass law because you would struggle to form majorities. You'd have to do it via coalition. That would be the check. It wouldn't be people like Alan Sugar and Justin Welby talking out their backsides and the law being passed regardless, which is our present system. Apparently it's a check. having the Lords involved. So yes, I think Justin Welby and the kind of persona he is really, as I said a moment ago, is emblematic of the flaws and failures of the British establishment. Just own this man, but he couldn't. And actually, just a quick correction to what you said, Michael. He said that the system today, the processes today, are better now than 50 or 60 years ago. I mean, is that the bar that you want to jump over? No ownership for his own screw-ups, no responsibility. Like I say, it just reminds me so much of a disease, frankly, which is ubiquitous across the establishment. They do not take responsibility when they mess up.
Trans healthcare for young people is currently under the spotlight in the United States as the Supreme Court decides whether to overturn the state of Tennessee's ban on gender-affirming care for people under 18. And the New York Times reports that the court, which has a conservative majority, is likely to uphold the ban. More than 20 states have similar laws. Now, in the United States, this issue is an incredibly partisan one. Republican states have made it a priority to pass legislation outlawing trans healthcare for young people. And on the other side of the aisle, the Biden administration is supporting the ACLU in its efforts to overturn the Tennessee ban. So you've got the Republicans on one side, the Democrats on one side, very much one side being anti-trans healthcare, the other side being pro-trans healthcare. Now, that sets the United States apart from the United Kingdom, where following the government-commissioned Cass report, banning puberty blockers for under 18s has cross-party support. In fact, last month, Wes Streeting renewed a temporary ban on the sale and supply of puberty-suppressing hormones for under 18s. The ban was introduced earlier this year by the Tories when they were still in government. Now, continuing the ban, it goes without saying, is incredibly controversial. Back in July, clinical psychologist at Gender Plus, Aidan Kelly, argued that banning puberty blockers should not be a decision for politicians to make. He argued, persuasively I think, that decisions around the tiny minority for whom the option could be helpful should be made by clinicians, not Wes Streeting. Aidan Kelly set up Gender Plus after the NHS-run Tavistock Gender Identity Development Service was shut down, and he's been attacked a number of times in the British press for doing so. But this week, he's been the subject of more positive reporting. That's because Gender Plus, which he founded, has just been rated outstanding by the government-run Care Quality Commission. Gender Plus was the first healthcare organisation of its kind to be registered with the Care Quality Commission, which is why this has made some headlines. I caught up with Aidan Kelly earlier today to discuss the current state of trans healthcare in Britain.
I think it's not in a good place, to be honest. I think there's a reality to that when, especially in adult services, if we use that as an example, where when an adult eventually gets seen at an adult NHS gender identity clinic, at least half of those that are being seen at the moment, due to the waits and everything else that's that are in place with the NHS clinics at the moment, at least half of them have already access private healthcare in advance of arriving at that first NHS appointment. So reality is that actually this area is being provided to at least half the population privately. And so it's obviously a significant departure from what we would expect in healthcare delivered predominantly in most of the areas via the NHS.
You've talked there about adult healthcare for trans people. Now, of course, it's healthcare for younger trans people, which has been controversial, and that was the subject of the Cass report. But you're saying actually adults are now struggling to gain access to trans healthcare on the NHS. Is that a consequence of the Cass report to some degree, or is that unrelated? Is that just sort of the NHS being under pressure and more people seeking these services?
I mean, it was happening pre-Cass report, but I think the same things that drove the existence or the feel that there was a need for the Cass review are also driving the same sort of factors that are making it harder for adults to access NHS gender care as well. And that is that there seems to be a general use of trans people to kind of evoke emotion, like politically, I suppose. There's a political scapegoating of the trans community. That means that it's not so popular to exist or to allocate more resource and time and effort in that area of healthcare. Of course, there's wider NHS issues that are kind of happening at the same time. So I don't deny that. But I think the trans community are be even worse served than the general community when it comes to healthcare for both adults and children. I think for children it's particularly bad. There's, I think, currently there's people who are at the top of the child list now for NHS services are waiting 6 years, which is crazy. When you think of a 12-year-old getting referred, they won't currently be seen within in a child service, which is absolutely crazy. And this so-called research trial that is supposed to be in place, there's still no sign of that coming close to happening either. So this kind of long, kind of argued over and talked about research trial isn't, as bad as, that might, some of the ideas around that might be, it's not even, that doesn't even exist really. And so even if you get into that service, one of the child services, your pathway is it's very unclear what actually they can offer you. So, we're getting in Gender Plus, more and more people coming to our service, accessing care, not just because they're on a list, but actually they've been offered appointments in the NHS service and they're opting not to take them up now, because they go, well, you know what, yes, it's cost money and yes, that's difficult, but actually I'm much happier with what the pathway looks like for us in Gender Plus. There's a relatively seamless kind of comprehensive clinical care that's on offer in line with what the NHS on paper should be offering, but actually we are delivering it. I think that's the difference.
Let's talk about the trials, because I remember we spoke sort of straight after the CAS review was released. And I mean, lots of things in it that I think you sort of differ with sort of the conclusion she came to. But one of the things you said was that, the call for new evidence, you can't argue with that. If she's saying we need some better evidence when it comes to puberty blockers, that's great. You're saying that, the ball hasn't really started rolling with that. So there was a demand in that for more evidence, collecting more evidence. There was kind of consensus. No one had a problem with that, but it's not happening.
Exactly. And it's the same thing in research has happened in the delivery of the healthcare. They have positioned people who have no experience in gender as preferred experts. And so people without expertise are now the best experts to have both delivering the healthcare. So there's no one, in these new services who's previously worked in the previous gender services, because it seemed that would be somehow a better move. And equally, the people who are delivering this research project are not renowned researchers in this field either. So they've never delivered big, large-scale research in this area. So you're starting off with a really, really complicated task, and you're tasking people who have no experience in this area with doing that task. And so it's not really surprising that nothing's happening, or that what is happening is incredibly slow, because these people don't have experience of doing this sort of work. And so, here we are, and no sign of the research trial starting. So that's what we're trying to do in Gender Plus is, I guess we've started hiring our own researchers. We've got a few research assistants. We've just had a research lead started as well. And so we plan on being able to, submit our own ethics application to try and do our own version of a research program, because the NHS simply doesn't seem to be doing it at all. So it's sad that it's falling on, what is kind of independent or private healthcare, which is converse to what we would want it to be happening with. It should be within the public system. But if failing them doing that, we feel an obligation that we should take on that challenge ourselves, really.
Is it basically the case that for trans healthcare, for anyone of any age in the UK right now, really you have to go private if you want a sort of smooth process, which means presumably you have to cough up a fair amount of money?
Yeah, private, or for those that can't afford it, it's something called DIY, which is, as it sounds, doing it yourself, and which is without proper medical supervision, buying these medications online. You don't know where it's coming from. You don't know, obviously, the right dosages. You don't know what your own current individual needs would be in terms of your own medical history, all that sort of stuff. So there's increasing numbers, and I mean under 18s here. We've come across in the last 6 months, I'd say in our clinic, there's been at least, I can think of at least half a dozen, 6, maybe 10 young people under the age of 18 who've been purchasing this medication online and self-administering it. That's incredibly worrying. And that's the result of what the NHS failures have been and what's happening now. And so, so those parents find out usually, and they come rushing to us going, oh my gosh, we were waiting for the NHS, but no, we can't wait anymore. We need to pay privately.
You've said sort of trans people have become a bit of a political football, and that seems to be affecting their medical care. Another group of people who've become, I suppose, political football are people like yourself, and people who work in the sector. I know, sort of researching for this interview, sort of GB News have written about you, the Daily Mail have written about you, generally in sort of fairly negative, sinister tones. Could you talk about how your work has been affected by, let's say, the political interest in what you do?
Nearly all of my colleagues here at Gender Plus have been previously who've worked at the JID service in the NHS. So I guess in a way we're used to it, but this is getting, it's been escalated. It keeps getting more, more and more and more kind of, toxic, aggressive, and I guess personal, probably, a lot of it at me, but some of my colleagues as well too. I think there was even an example of a year ago, one of those tabloids that you mentioned, turning up outside the clinic with a photographer trying to take photos through the clinic window, no care for the people who might be attending our appointments, no care for what effect that might have on children essentially attending medical appointments at all. So it's not just me directly. They're probably looking to take a photo of me or whatever, but it creates a really hostile environment to just exist in this field. And so obviously that takes its toll at times. Obviously we've got a nice, close knit, well-run team here. Our culture is really strong. We really kind of look after each other, and we have to really, actually, I suppose. So to do this work, you need to be very supportive of one another, offer a lot of staff support, obviously, so that we can support our clients or our patients as well, to withstand this. But the reality is that when we were in the NHS, we couldn't really speak out. We couldn't say very much. But now we're outside of that. We've kind of taken a different approach, that it's now possible to actually call out some of this, speak to some of the work that we do, share our expertise, contribute positively to the dialogue, because actually these are real people behind these numbers. These are real lives. These are just like me, you, where there are our siblings, our partners, our children, our family, our neighbors. This is real people, real life. And we need to be able to let the public know that that's who we're talking about. This is what all of this affects. And so it's important that we don't vilify trans people. It's important that we normalize it. And unfortunately, if that means that people like me cop a bit of slack or a bit of flack, then I suppose, sadly, that's a price to pay, but it feels like a worthwhile one.
Let's talk about events in the United States this week. The Supreme Court is currently hearing a case which is supported by the Biden administration to try and overturn a ban by the state of Tennessee, who alongside a number of Republican states have banned the use of puberty for under 18s, and I think all other sorts of trans healthcare, actually, not just puberty blockers. As far as I understand from following the case, some of the more conservative judges have sort of said, well, what Tennessee are doing is kind of in line with, countries like the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has a Labour government. This isn't a political issue. Let's just look at these European countries who've taken a slightly different approach. What do you sort of make of the way in which the UK is being used now as an example in other countries who are, having their own disputes about trans healthcare for young people?
It's more kind of misinformation and misleading kind of narrative around what's actually happening. The current NHS England policy document released in March of 2024 around the prescribing of gender-affirming hormones to those aged 16 and above, 16 and 17, is that actually that's a permissible, allowable pathway, and that in policy is that there should be this research trial going for those blockers. So it's not saying we're not prescribing blockers. It's not saying that it's this medication that simply shouldn't be used. It's saying that there needs to be more evidence behind it. But that gets misrepresented because in practice, what is happening is that pathways are being shut down via the NHS. And of course, the temporary current puberty blocker ban is in place, but that's due to run out at the end of this month. What's going to happen? We have to wait and see. But I think when these, like in Supreme Court, I think they point to the UK practice being the same with its policy. And actually, UK policy is not that this should not exist. It's not that these pathways should not be there. It's just that in practice, it's not providing it. And so, they don't point to our European partners where there's, France and Germany. There's only France, I think, is it this week or last week came out with their own kind of clinical guidelines, basically in support of the use of puberty blockers and in sex hormones for adolescents. And so, there are plenty of examples of places where good clinical care is being provided, but I think it's been, with the complexity of the field, it's very easy to misrepresent what's happening and label it all, put it all down to the CAS report. And although the CAS report was not, problem free, it didn't call for all of these things that are now becoming practice. And so it's being misrepresented, I think, in that Supreme Court case.
This, I think, could be the big good news story of 2024. The world appears to be finally waking up to the dangers of smartphones, especially for kids.
Social media is doing social harm to our young Australians, and I am calling time on it. The safety and mental health of our young people has to be a priority, and my government will do all that we can to protect our young Australians, but also to provide support for parents and teachers who are dealing with these issues. I want Australian parents to know that we have your back.
That was Australia's Prime Minister announcing a ban on social media for under 16s last month. The legislation was then passed in Parliament a week ago, and that law will come into force next year, and it will make platforms including TikTok, Facebook, Snapchat, X, and Instagram liable for fines of up to $33 million for systemic failures to prevent children younger than 16 from holding accounts. Those fines might need to be a bit bigger, right? These are multi-billion-dollar companies in any case. We'll talk later about whether this kind of ban can work in practice. First, though, let's look at some of the evidence that has really persuaded me that this kind of action is absolutely necessary. So the first and most crude evidence, really, is the rise in self-reported anxiety since the rise of smartphones. So in the United States, a number of people telling official surveys they feel nervous all or most of the time. That's a really worrying thing to tell someone. That has rocketed since 2010. The increase is most extreme for people aged 18 to 25, where the figure has gone from 8 to 18% of all respondents. The number of anxious young millennials has also doubled. Of course, one could look at this data and reasonably suggest it doesn't show people are actually more anxious, but rather that they are more comfortable saying so. That would be perfectly plausible as a hypothesis. However, that doesn't seem to be the case. And as John Byrne-Murdoch showed in a Financial Times column recently, we have tragically objective measures of a decline in mental health. Since 2010, which Byrne-Murdoch calls the smartphone era, rates of teen suicides has risen sharply in both the United States and the UK. In both countries, the suicide rate among teenage girls has more than doubled, though it still remains below the rate for boys. Of course, nothing I have shown you yet shows this decline in mental health among young people is because of the rise of smartphones. It could just be a coincidence, and there could be something else causing that decline in mental health. Again, this is completely plausible. However, the data also shows a relationship between poor mental health and actual mobile phone use. So American psychologist Jean Twenge has shown that rates of self-harm are positively correlated with daily hours of social media use. Again, this is correlation, but it's showing it doesn't seem to be just some coincidence that it started in 2010. There does seem to be some relationship between self-harm and hours of social media use. And the mechanism by which smartphone use could damage mental health are intuitively, I think, incredibly obvious. That's why it doesn't surprise me remotely that these things would have a bad effect on children. Of course, apps like Instagram make adults feel insecure and competitive and inadequate, right? This is the effect they have on those of us with developed brains. So why would we expect them to be better for people whose minds are still forming, right? It seems bizarre that we ever thought this was a good idea. Social media, of course, also allows bullying to go into overdrive, and this could be the key factor. I think social media seems to be, to some degree, replacing the habit of meeting people in real life. This is from John Byrne-Murdoch. Again, the blue line shows the number of American teens who say they meet up with friends once a month or less. It doubled after 2010 from 5 to 10%. The proportion of teens who disagreed with the statement, "It feels good to be alive," increased by almost the exact same degree. So you've got lots of people there sort of suggesting something really, really terrible about their mental health. They're disagreeing with the statement, "It feels good to be alive." And then also at the same time, you're seeing this massive increase in people who aren't seeing their friends more than once a month, right? Which, as a child, is really tragic. Given all this evidence, then, could the UK follow Australia's lead? Peter Carl is the Science and Technology Minister.
I don't want to go to things like blanket bans because I want people to benefit from all of the opportunities presented by modern technology. But where there are harms, I will keep everything on the table when it comes to keeping people safe. We need to know precisely what the impact is because, and it's a frustration of mine, that tech companies themselves aren't building this evidence. I mean, if I was producing products that were used by more than half of teenagers, sometimes 10-year-olds, sometimes 5-year-olds are having access to these products, I would want to know exactly what the impact that my products were having on those kids, on those people, particularly with vulnerabilities. They're not doing that. So I'm trying to do what I can do to find out where the evidence is behind the impact that social media has on children, young people, and people with vulnerabilities, so that I can build policies that sometimes might be strident policies, but they need to be built on firm evidence because the evidence just simply isn't there at the moment. And I'm open-minded as to what that means going forward. Already, guidance has gone out so that handsets shouldn't be used in schools. I think that's working. But with the impact it has in other areas, I'm open-minded, but it has to be built on evidence and based on evidence going forward.
Now, Aaron, this is something I feel really passionately about, right? And it's because I'm an adult and I feel like I have actually a reasonable degree of self-control. I don't think I have a particularly addictive personality, but I still, find myself, just glued to my screen. I've deleted Instagram and Twitter just in the last couple of weeks, actually, because I was listening to a podcast by Jonathan Haidt, who talks a lot about the damage that constant screen use is doing to people. And already I feel a lot more liberated, right? The issue I had was sort of any time I had 3 seconds spare, like my partner's gone to the public loo or something, or I'm waiting in between sets in the gym, I immediately go to Twitter, and then you're in this spiral where you're on there for ages. Now I look at my phone, I scroll towards Twitter, can't see it, and I just feel this huge sort of sigh of relief. And yet we've given this to young people, and no wonder they seem to be having all sorts of problems. Do you agree with me on this one?
I'm inclined to agree, certainly. What I would say is it's not just social media. I think it's the combination of social media with mobile telephony. 3 and 4G phones really were a game changer in how we engaged with Web 2.0. So you get the internet giving up applications like Facebook, YouTube. That really starts after 2005, 2006. But I can really remember, Michael, after 2010, and that's correlating with the data you just showed a moment ago, those platforms as apps on phones, which are constantly available, that's when the real shift happens. There was still a lot of optimism around these platforms prior to that. And it used to be, really fun. You'd have a hard day's work, we'd be out with your friends, and you'd go online. And there was a big shift all of a sudden with smartphones to being permanently online, like I say, with 3G around 15 years ago, becoming widely available. There are a couple of fixes to this, of course. You can say on the level of the individual, well, they can change their consumption habits. There are people now who buy quote unquote dumb phones or smartphones, which aren't quite as smart. I probably will join those individuals, I think, at some point. James Marriott, columnist at the Times, has talked about getting a Cat S22 flip phone, a dumb phone. Now, of course, children don't have that option necessarily. They certainly aren't treated as individuals capable of autonomous self-control. That's why they're children, which is why policy needs to step in. And I can understand why Australia is doing what it's done. I think under 16s, a complete ban on social media, we'll see. I certainly think there should be a prohibition on smartphones in schools. I don't think there should be guidelines. I think it should be a ban on phones in schools, 100%. And already, Michael, not many people are aware of this, but actually to use Facebook in this country, in most countries, you need to be 13 or older. When you start a Facebook account, you need to be 13 or older. And if you're younger than 13, you need parental consent. Now, how does that work? It's literally just clicking something on a screen, moving on, uploading my profile picture. That's not good enough. So for people who are skeptical of what we're talking about here, the data you've just shown moved by Australia and whatnot, by Facebook's own reckoning, they don't want people under 13 using their platform without parental consent. What I would say is a good starting point, alongside the prohibition of phones in schools, would probably be to ban social media for under 13s. I think that's a sensible place to start, and then you take it from there. Of course, there are going to be loopholes in these things. I find it quite amusing, for instance, that young people won't be able to use Facebook, X, Snap, Instagram. Does this mean that Australian kids under 16 are going to sort of herd-like go towards LinkedIn? Is that going to be the young person's social platform? Of course, we may see some really strange stuff as a result. And of course, YouTube isn't included in this. So you might see a golden age of young people in Australia all of a sudden getting involved in YouTube. Maybe YouTube accounts may be used in ways which are more similar to how we use Facebook in this country, for instance, or Instagram or X as personal accounts. Who knows? But I think the general principle is correct. And I think the diagnosis is correct, which is that social media in combination with smartphones, and I think that's not really been touched upon quite enough in this debate, in combination with smartphones, has led to a ton of major downsides for young people. There have been upsides too. But the point of any technology is that it's regulated in such a way that the upsides outweigh the downsides. And I want to read a quote from one of my favorite thinkers, Neil Postman. He wrote an amazing book called Technopoly, which is about our relationship to technology with its present iteration. You know, if you were a Marxist, you might say, under contemporary capitalism. This is from Postman. The idea of human progress, as Francis Bacon expressed it, has been replaced by the idea of technological progress. The aim is not to reduce ignorance, superstition, and suffering, but to accommodate ourselves to the requirements of new technologies. And that, to me, really sums up where we've been with smartphones. Is this technology allowing us to, quote, reduce ignorance, superstition, and suffering? Is it allowing the flourishing of individuals? In some contexts, absolutely. But I don't think that's been the framework and the prism through which we've tried to understand this stuff. There have been major, major downsides. Can we, as societies, regulate them in such a way as to reduce those downsides and actually enjoy more of the upsides, the sociality, the learning, the ability to network and learn new perspectives and points of view that weren't previously available? I think we can do that, actually. Personally, with regards to the Australian legislation, I think it looks pretty harsh, 16. I would go with 13, but I suspect this won't be the last country that takes such a step.
I want to talk a bit more about the politics of this. The backlash against social media has a very interesting ideological flavour because it has just as much support from the right as from the left. And in fact, Donald Trump's pick to be Surgeon General, that's the nation's top doctor, has previously called for banning social media for teens. So I agree with her position on that. After the attempted assassination of Donald Trump by a 20-year-old, Jeanette Neshawat, so she is the person who's been nominated to be Surgeon General, told Fox News this.
I think social media has had a tremendous negative impact on all aspects of society, especially our younger generations. What happens is, especially those who may have underlying mental or emotional issues, they become alienated, they feel rejected, they have a sense of anger and hostility towards others. They don't have the coping mechanisms to handle their stress and their anger. And sometimes we see that manifest with violence. We see that they are just withdrawn from society. They are withdrawn from their family, from their friends, from their community. And sometimes they are just obsessed with violence.
Now, I actually find this line on social media less persuasive, right? As I say, I'm not so worried. I mean, a bit worried, but my overwhelming worry about social media isn't that it's sort of injecting violent fantasies into young people. It's that it's stopping them have experiences. It's not so much what it is doing to them, it's what it's not allowing them to do, which is have a sort of fulfilling life in the real world because it's so distracting. Aaron, any comments on sort of what has gone before or this comment from the nominated Surgeon General?
Well, she seems kind of crazy. So I don't think she's necessarily the best advert for the point of view that we're trying to make, Michael. She seems kind of crazy. I don't think it's making people angrier. Actually, that's at odds with what the data said a moment ago. It's making people more introverted, more anxious, etc., if anything. Just to go back against personal experience, I mean, I was incredibly, I've only ever been a happy person until 2010. And of course, I had difficult things as well. I had to move 15 times in 15 years, the housing crisis. I graduated into the global financial crisis in 2007. That was the labor market I entered. So I had tough stuff to go through. You know, I've had depression since then. And I have to be honest, depression and anxiety, which I've never get over anything, but you know, I've dealt with it fundamentally. And I have to be honest, I do think social media and phones are a big part of it. I just do. Now, that's not going to be everybody, of course. But it is not natural for anybody on the planet to be able to contact you at any hour of the day about anything, which is what Insta, Facebook, X, etc. are. That is not natural. It's certainly not precedented. It's certainly new. It's new in the human experience. Okay. And of course, as I said a moment ago, it has upsides. It also has downsides. And for an adult, the upsides and the downsides, they're for you to manage, right? There are upsides and downsides with alcohol. We don't ban alcohol, thank goodness. With children, however, it's of course slightly different. And that's why we've got regulation coming in. So on a personal level, I entirely have seen it, the difference it made. You know, when I was doing my degree, I spent a year in Italy doing Erasmus in Florence. And just to pick up what you said a few moments ago, Michael, I am so happy I didn't have a smartphone. There was some social media, not much, but I didn't really use it. But the idea that I wouldn't have immersed myself in that experience, learned the language, got to meet so many people. You know, if I had a day that I wasn't going to university, I would go to, you know, the old Medici library in San Lorenzo, or you go to the National Library in Santa Croce, or you go to the south side of the river, Santa Spirito, get a beer. I got a job. I met people. I talked to people. I went to a gym. I met Italians. I met all kinds of people. And if I'd had a phone with social media, the experience would have been completely different. And I think qualitatively worse. I would have been less challenged. I wouldn't have, you know, just things like finding somewhere to live. You had to talk to people you never met before in a language you didn't know. You had to, you know, test yourself. You had to really stretch your capacities as a person. I really enjoyed that. And I'm really grateful for that. And I think people who've had that and have the new stuff, I think we're really lucky, actually. And I think sometimes we're not granting that same good luck to younger generations by saying sometimes there are contexts where you don't want everything to be convenient, where it's actually quite useful to be bored, because then you have to go and do something to make yourself feel a bit more alive and a bit more interested in the world. So I think my personal experience totally tallies with yours. And I cited Neil Postman. I now want to cite Dune, Michael, one of my favorite books. And by the way, people that think, oh, you know, what a lib take, you're saying that things should be banned. Not at all, by the way. Actually existing socialism, like the USSR, loved banning stuff, including microwaves. So this idea that the state prohibiting stuff is necessarily like lib is just simply not true. We are accommodating our young people to the needs of big tech, of the world's $1 trillion plus companies, the other side of the planet. It is not radical to say that we should do that with no democratic oversight. I would say it's the complete opposite, in fact. Here's that line from Dune. Men turned their thinking over to machines in the hope that this would set them free. But that only permitted other men with machines to enslave them. Now, that might apply to artificial intelligence. I certainly think it applies to big tech and social media. We viewed these places as emancipatory, freeing places, but in fact, I think that's anything but. And of course, X under Elon Musk is a really strong case in point. The idea that an individual, me, you, least of all a child, is able to deal with the addictive capacities of these platforms, I think is ridiculous. Some of the smartest people in the world have built these platforms to be highly addictive, as addictive with intermittent rewards as gambling machines. That's literally the design prototype these things have been built upon. intermittent rewards. You don't get a reward each time, you only get it sometimes. So for that dopamine, you keep on going regardless. It's the quickest way to build a powerful pathway to addiction and addictive tendencies, which is what this stuff is built on. They've literally built it to be like that. That is not a hot take from Michael Walker or Aaron Bastani on Novara Media. That is literally the revenue model. Because the more addiction, the more focus, the more attention, the more ad revenue, the more market cap, right? That's why Meta, that's why Alphabet are these trillion-dollar companies. So I would say you can't just have the response, well, if you don't want to use those platforms, don't use them. The kid shouldn't use them. That kid doesn't have a chance on this side of the screen against on the other side of the screen, thousands of the world's most intelligent developers trying to create the most addictive product possible. They don't stand a chance. So I think that's where you have to have state regulation. At the level of adults, get a dumb phone. By the way, Michael, I do think that will be a trend for people like yourself. I do think gradually, over the next 5, 10, 15 years, people will just say, I don't need the latest phone. I actually don't want a phone with a large screen. I like using it for WhatsApp and Spotify and maps. I don't want to watch YouTube on my phone. Sorry if people are watching YouTube on their phones watching this. I like watching YouTube on my phone. But you know what? I really like watching YouTube on my TV or on my laptop. It's a nicer experience. And I think people are going to be more selective with regards to their consumption habits on digital devices. And I'll say this final point, again, about whether or not the left should be saying these things. Oh my God, you're such a lib. You're just agreeing with states prohibiting and banning things. Marx talks about communism and the project around it as fundamentally the redistribution of leisure time, right? He says that we need a post-work society so that actually the true essence of humans, our species being, as he calls it, can come to the fore. We can be, literary critics, hunters, and fishermen, all in the same day. That's what he says. And I think it's really important for everyone, but actually socialists in particular, to take that question of leisure time and how we spend our leisure time really, really seriously. And the reality is, as somebody who loves social media, who's gained a lot from social media, who doesn't want to get rid of social media, the reality is, of course, we should be more thoughtful about how we engage with these platforms as societies. And when it comes to kids, yes, they absolutely need protecting.
Two very argumentative men were on Question Time this week. This was Alastair Campbell and Nigel Farage discussing a speech Keir Starmer had given earlier in the day.
I was disappointed. And Nigel says that immigration is the big bursting issue. I was disappointed Keir didn't mention Brexit, because I think Brexit has done so much damage to this country. Well, I'm sorry, Nigel. I'm sorry. And Nigel doesn't want to accept.
You are the worst loser in history, Alastair.
No.
Get over it. It's 8 years ago.
Nigel,
Move on.
No, you won.
It's done.
You're the worst winner.
It's done.
Because you've never taken responsibility for what you've won.
It's done. No, we're independent. We're free, and we're not part of that Eurozone that's collapsing around its ears.
I'll tell you what
Rejoice.
you are, Nigel.
We're out.
I'll tell you what you
we're
are.
free.
I'll tell you what you are. You're somebody, and we've seen it already tonight, you're somebody who will exploit any problem going for your own political ends. Brexit was a fundamentally damaging thing to this country. That is your one legacy, and you now don't even want to talk about it, because even you
I want to talk about it.
know that it has damaged this country, it's made us poorer, it's made us weaker, and it's hit our standing in the world.
No, as I say, this major decision was taken 8 years ago. It gave us the chance. Gave us a chance
5%
to be significantly richer.
Gone.
Gave us the chance to control our borders.
We didn't do it
all
your
those
way.
things, and sadly, this mob,
We didn't do it
the
your
Tories,
way.
didn't
If
do
we'd done it
any of
Nigel's way, it would all have been
So,
sunlit.
would you
apples
rather be like
and
France right now, or Germany
No, I wouldn't.
right now? Well,
the
really?
comparison is what we would be if we'd have stayed in. 5% bigger economy.
No, we'd have joined the
5%.
Euro if you'd had your way back 30 years ago.
You see, what you'll do is you'll throw up a different argument.
Hang on, don't talk at the same time.
It's over. The war is over.
I'm sorry about that, Nigel, because I think you'll find
the war
young
is
people
over.
in this country know that you've taken their
The
future
war
away
is
from them,
over.
and they will get it back.
Move on.
That was Alastair Campbell and Nigel Farage. Now let's hear from the third most argumentative man in Britain, Aaron Bastani. What did you make of that clip?
Well, by the way, Farage is correct that the end goal for people like Campbell in the late 1990s was Britain joining the euro. That's just true. That is just a fact. That was the plan. Thank God we didn't. And for people that say, no, we should join the euro is a really good idea. The idea that the debt spreads, the idea that a country like Germany, which has run surpluses every year since goodness knows when, the idea that they can borrow at the same rate as somebody like Italy, which hasn't run a surplus since 1925, or Greece, which has defaulted 101 times in its history as a country, is crazy. You're not pricing risk properly. And it took away from countries like Italy the ability to devalue their currency to help exports, etc. Crazy idea. It's made so much of Europe so much poorer. One of the very few good decisions this country's political elite made was us not joining the euro. First point. Secondly, when you look at Alastair Campbell, what's his sort of political horizon? For people like me, it's very cheap, affordable, successful, high-speed rail, trams, house building, rent caps, renewable energy, publicly owned AI, scrapping tuition fees, a high productivity, high living standards economy. What's it for Alastair Campbell? 5% higher GDP. That was it. If we'd stop Brexit, GDP would be 5% higher. Really? You're litigating this. And what would that even mean, by the way? What materially does that mean? What does it mean? I don't know. There are countries out there with 5% higher GDP. I'd rather live in Britain. We have publicly owned healthcare, etc. So what does it mean? There are some states in the US, they're 5% wealthier than the UK. I'd rather live here. Anyway, I think it says a lot. And seeing Farage speak with the confidence that he had, seeing Campbell, I think really underscores, Michael, that my God, Farage has been tearing up trees in British politics for the last 20 years, but maybe he hasn't actually started yet. Maybe he's still got a long way to go. This sounds insane, but I genuinely would not be surprised now at this point, with the wind in his sails as it is, I would not be surprised if at some point in the future, Nigel Farage has a great office of state. People are saying he'll be prime minister. I think that's probably quite outlandish. I think Reform getting the most seats would be crazy. But you can certainly see how they might be in some kind of coalition or some kind of electoral agreement with the Conservatives in the future. And clearly, part of that deal would be Farage being a very powerful person. And I think he would quite like Home Secretary. So it really, for me, just showed the wind in the sails of Farage. And yes, Alastair Campbell has this hugely successful podcast. Well done, Alastair Campbell. But looking at that, he really is, politically speaking, yesterday's man.
Yesterday's man who can sell out the O2 with Rory Stewart. Strange times we live in. Aaron Bastani, thank you so much for joining me this evening. Always a pleasure speaking to you on a Friday.
Always a pleasure, Michael. And I wish a wonderful weekend to all our viewers and listeners out there.
I second that. Thank you everyone for watching tonight. Come back on Monday for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.